Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at a video that was published by Fairhaven Baptist College, which is not only an unaccredited college, but it is an unaccredited college that has a whole page on their website dedicated to explaining that seeking accreditation is a compromise that will jeopardize the student's spiritual health and well-being. And they frame it as though the accrediting institutions really want to give them accreditation, but they are standing firm on their principles and not accepting it. Their accreditation page is quite the read if you're interested. They have a school that goes all the way from kindergarten to supposed college level, offering a master's degree that is obtained in one semester, with many of the classes being less than a week long. I don't think it's the spiritual compromise that stops them from being accredited. Well, they posted videos of several of their classes online. I'm not sure whether these classes are supposed to be high school or college. She does say a few things that make me lean more towards the college level, but let's take a look.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about the geological features of the Earth, and again we have two models or paradigms, the creationist paradigm and the evolutionary paradigm.
Congrats on not calling it the evolutionist paradigm. Small victories, I guess.
Now, as far as the creationist paradigm, what view of geology goes with the creationist paradigm? We have two opposing views, uniformitarianism and catastrophism.
Except, if you actually look at it, you'll see that those proposing catastrophism generally accept uniformitarianism to a certain degree, but have other, usually theological motivations for proposing a catastrophic event in the past, while geologists who accept uniformitarianism also accept that occasional catastrophes are a part of it, but avoid making supernatural claims. So yeah, the asteroid that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs was catastrophic and had some major geologic effects like the global layer of iridium, but the understanding is that these events are the exception rather than the norm, and they are not the main driving force of the geologic processes of the Earth, processes that we can observe today, processes that even creationists have to admit are happening today, like the movement of the tectonic plates and how this movement causes mountains to grow and rifts to deepen. So the choice isn't between catastrophism and uniformitarianism, really. It's about the motivations of the geologist. If the geologist just wants to understand how the world works, they will end up at a uniformitarian view. If, however, they are theologically motivated to search for evidence of a particular catastrophe, then they will start with a catastrophic view and ignore the data that points to uniformitarianism. And it's worth mentioning that uniformitarianism is not the view that everything happens at a constant rate. It would be more properly called gradualism. It is the view that the processes we can observe today are largely the same processes that would have been happening in the past, and this view is supported by evidence.
So part of the creation paradigm is, of course, we're taking the entire book of Genesis. So what does that mean? That means we believe that the Genesis flood was an actual event and it was global in scale.
Yes, glad you're willing to admit that. The creationist view is catastrophism, and it begins with the assumption that Noah's flood was real and global. So you start with the catastrophe and work your way back through the evidence, ignoring any that doesn't support the catastrophic model.
It's the study of the Earth, its features, the materials of which it is made. So of course that would be rocks and minerals. Its structures and the processes acting upon them. That is a creationist view of geology.
Really? That's the creationist view? So when you look at the process of continental drift and see how the Indian tectonic plate is being subducted under the Asian tectonic plate to lift the Himalayan mountains, you then conclude that this observable process that we can see happening today is the process that created the Himalayas slowly over millions of years? Somehow I doubt that.
All right. However, this science was the first science to be influenced, changed, altered, whatever, by evolutionary thinking.
And here we see classic creationist equivocation, where they attempt to make any science that they disagree with a part of evolution, so they can just dismiss it offhand. But yeah, geology was one of the first sciences that I am aware of that got us to old ages for the Earth using scientific methods, though certainly religious methods had been used in the past. After all, in Hindu cosmology, the Earth is 4.32 billion years old. That is much closer to the correct scientific answer than biblical creationism gets you. Though, interestingly, James Hutton, the geologist who was one of the first to provide scientific reasons to believe the Earth is old, actually proposed a basic idea of evolution by natural selection, one which was tucked away in a chapter of his voluminous and apparently underappreciated book, which was described by his biographer as being so long and written with such obscurity that it was prevented from being properly appreciated. But while Hutton did breeding experiments with plants and identified natural selection as a mechanism for change, he drew the line at speciation, instead believing that the capacity to adapt to an environment was evidence of benevolent design in nature.
By the idea that the Earth cannot be only 6,000 years old. We don't have creation. There was no flood. So this science was affected first.
As I mentioned, Hutton very much believed that the Earth was designed or created. He had no beliefs that would have required him to believe that the Earth is old. He came to that conclusion based on scientific observations.
And this science is pretty much founded on uniformitarianism and old Earth chronology. Okay? It predates evolutionary biology.
Sort of. As I have just pointed out, Hutton developed his own theory of evolutionary biology. It was rudimentary and he placed arbitrary limits on it without evidence, but the fact that species change and adapt to their environments has been known since the time of the ancient Greek philosophers. Darwin gets credit for it because he took it out of the realm of speculation and placed it firmly in the realm of science, but it has been known about for a while.
After all, Charles Darwin, on his survey trip on the HMS Beagle, he brought with him a book called Principles of Geology, written by a man named Sir Charles Lyell.
Yes, Charles Lyell, the man who rejected evolution at first when presented with Lamarckian evolution. Though certainly Lyell was against proposing miraculous events as explanations for our observations. He once made an analogy when writing to one of his colleagues who studied tides, that if he were to have a source of information that is not to be questioned, that there were a sudden extreme tidal variation just 10,000 years ago, and you failed to find a natural explanation, you could propose that a god, creator of all things, surely has the ability to create or destroy new moons or other heavenly bodies that could explain these tides anytime he chooses, but without evidence, such ideas are mere conjecture. In other words, Lyell admitted that it is possible that the Earth is young and God just made things in a way that make it appear old, but without appealing to such conjecture, it is apparent that the Earth is old. Lyell did not have a philosophical or religious reason to believe in an old Earth. He just followed the evidence and didn't think that God would play such tricks on humanity.
Who was a evolutionary geologist.
I don't think there is, or ever has been, such a thing as an evolutionary geologist. He certainly was a self-identified uniformitarian, but seeing as how he rejected evolution until after Darwin convinced him of it, I don't think it's fair to call him an evolutionary geologist when talking about the book of his that Darwin took on his journey on the Beagle.
So here is a modern definition of geology. Notice the difference in paradigm.
Your two definitions are not mutually exclusive. I fail to see a problem with this one. Even if the Earth is young, the study of the dynamics and physical history of the Earth, the rocks of which it is composed, and the physical, chemical, and biological changes that the Earth has undergone or is undergoing would still be a valid definition. I'm a bit unsure of the biological component of that, but certainly they can be linked. After all, biological processes can lead to geologic features. Limestone is usually made up of the skeletal remains of biological organisms, and an estimated 10% of all sedimentary rock is limestone. So biology can absolutely affect geology, and again, this isn't specific to non-creationist geologists. The creationist ones fully admit this. They just think that all the animals whose remains form the limestone existed at the same time, which is impossible.
Okay, geology is the science that deals with the dynamics and physical what? History of the Earth.
Yeah. Is the history of the Earth a problem for you? If it was created 6,000 years ago, then it has a 6,000-year history. There's nothing about how long that history has to be in this definition.
The rocks of which it is composed, and the physical, chemical, and even biological changes that the earth has, what tense is that? Past tense. Undergone or is undergoing.
Yes, even biological, because limestone. And why is it important that has undergone is in past tense, especially with the present tense being right beside it? Also worth mentioning is that this is the definition of geology at dictionary.com. It seems to be an adequate definition to me, but if you want to pull apart and attack a word based on its definition, you really should go to a technical dictionary for that. A common dictionary like this one is just describing how the word is currently popularly used, while a technical dictionary is more likely to state that this is how a word should be used when discussing it in a technical context. One is more descriptive and the other is more prescriptive.
I deleted the idea of history and origins out of my definition of geology because that is historical science. It is not operational science.
Why would that matter? Even if the creationist distinction between historical and observational or operational science were a valid one, which it isn't, a study of the history of rocks would still qualify as geology. Removing anything that is evidence of past events from the study of geology would also wipe out anything that a creationist might consider evidence for the flood.
And keep in mind that of all the things science has done for us, very little of that has been accomplished by evolutionary biology or evolutionary geology.
Even if you're right, which I suspect you're not, very little is still a non-zero amount, meaning that evolutionary biology and geology have both contributed to our scientific advancement by your own admission. Now, as far as biology is concerned, basically everything we know about biology has its foundation in evolution, so that statement is flat out wrong on its face. Though I will admit that the scientific advances we have made because of geology have not had their basis in the theory of evolution. Mostly because the theory of evolution just doesn't cover geology, though certainly there is some reciprocal illumination going on, where a discovery in geology can clear up a mystery for evolutionary biologists, and vice versa.
Uniformitarianism explains how the earth got here without God, so without creation, and without the flood.
Well, if we go back to Charles Lyell's hypothetical about tides changing drastically in the past, let's just see if he just assumes that no gods were involved. The antagonist in this hypothetical interaction says, "The same power which created man and gave him dominion over the earth may at times create and then annihilate a heavenly body, or change the volume or density of those which now exist." To which might be replied, "I admit the possibility of these changes in the system, but they are mere arbitrary conjectures. I feel much more confidence in the probable uniformity of the condition of the heavenly bodies for an indefinite period of time, whether past or future, than I feel in my own knowledge." Skipping ahead a bit, we then get to, "Sedgwick was wrong if he imagined that I began with a priori reasoning on any assumed uniformity of physical events. I was taught by Buckland the catastrophic or paroxysmal theory, but before I wrote my first volume, I had come round, after considerable observation and reading, to the belief that a bias toward the opposite system was more philosophical." So, in Lyell's own words, he started with an education that taught him the catastrophic model of geology. It was evidence that changed his mind.
How did the earth get here? And how was the earth changed without the flood?
No, we don't look to see how the earth changed without the flood. We just look to see what the evidence says. And the evidence says, pretty conclusively at this point, that there was no global flood 4,000 years ago. And this evidence is corroborated with several other branches of science, so it's pretty solid.
The rocks of which it is composed, and the physical, chemical, and even biological changes that the earth has gone. What tense? Past. One of the problems with historical science is that it happened in the past. So it's not directly subject to observation or experimentation.
The key here is right there on your own slide. Right after the past tense has undergone comes the present tense or is undergoing. The present is the key to the past. We observe geological processes happening today, and we use the knowledge we gain from such observation to figure out what happened in the past.
Catastrophic plate tectonics is a good way to explain how the continent, the Earth probably was a single continent, how that broke up into the continents that we have today.
It's only a good explanation if you ignore all the evidence and appeal to magic instead. The amount of energy required to move the continental plates the distances that are needed in the short time of the flood are such that the entire Earth would have been a molten ball for tens of millions of years afterward. At least, according to the creationist geophysicist John Baumgartner in his 1990 paper, which explained that creationists need to be more comfortable with the suggestion that God messed with the laws of physics to make the flood happen. I mean, sure, I've run some numbers before and found that a ridiculous amount of energy would be needed to accomplish that, but I'm not a geophysicist. If a creationist geophysicist can't make it work without messing with the laws of nature, then I don't think you can stand there and say that the evidence is on your side.
Of course, we're talking catastrophic plate tectonics, not uniformitarian plate tectonics.
Yeah. But uniformitarian plate tectonics are the only type we've ever observed. But sure, let's accept the catastrophe that is impossible according to the laws of physics as calculated by a young Earth creationist as our plate tectonic model. Makes perfect sense. Especially when appealing to historical science as being unreliable, instead favoring only what we can observe in the present. There are no inconsistencies with this worldview at all.
It has use as an operational science. It is still a model or a theory because obviously we cannot, go to outer space and look through the Earth with some type of X-ray vision and see the plates.
The person that this school hired to teach a science class doesn't know the difference between the colloquial use of the word theory and the scientific use of the word theory. A scientific theory is an entire body of knowledge that explains a phenomenon or group of phenomena. It encompasses various scientific facts, laws, and hypotheses, and there will be areas of the theory that are well understood, as well as areas that are poorly understood. But how well we understand certain aspects of the theory doesn't really impact the fact that the theory is the explanation for the phenomenon. In order to be considered a theory, the explanation has to be extremely well evidenced and demonstrated through several different approaches. In the case of plate tectonics, the movement of the plates has been directly measured by bouncing lasers off satellites and using GPS markers, as well as indirectly measured using the arrival times of natural radio signals at different radio telescopes, which can be used to calculate the distance between the telescopes to within 2 centimeters. As the continents move, the telescopes move with them, or the GPS markers, or the stations that emit laser bursts. So the theory of plate tectonics is not a theory because we have no way of directly observing the plates. It's a theory because so much evidence points to it being correct that we are as certain that it is correct as it is possible to be in science.
Geological cycles. Does the Earth recycle its raw materials?
Yes, this kind of goes along with plate tectonics, which you seem to at least partially accept. I skipped it, but she even explained how the tectonic plates are subducted into the mantle. The plates are made of rock, they get subducted, and the rock melts into magma, sometimes only partially, resulting in physical and chemical changes that give us metamorphic rock, but sometimes fully. The material then makes its way back to the surface, and the cycle continues.
And even the rock cycle. Rocks are recycled as well. So we have plate tectonics as a valid theory or model in geology. We also know that we have geologic cycles.
Okay, so you accept the rock cycle. Now, using observational science, we measure how quickly the rocks are subducted and how quickly they form, and we notice that it's not very quickly at all, meaning that the Earth has to be millions of years old to account for the diversity of rock types that we see on it. If the flood resulted in catastrophic plate tectonics that melted the entire surface of the Earth, as such rapid tectonic activity certainly would have, then we would expect the vast majority of the rocks on the surface to be igneous. Well, actually we'd expect it to still be molten, but had it somehow cooled really quickly, the rocks would all be igneous. But that's not what we see. We see mostly sedimentary rocks on the surface, almost like the various processes that produce sedimentary rocks have been going on for millions to billions of years.
The problem comes with uniformitarianism. What is uniformitarianism? It's a presupposition that belongs to the evolutionary paradigm.
Quite the contrary, it is actually an evidence-based conclusion. As I have pointed out, there are several assumptions that have to be made in order to hold to catastrophism, such as the idea that rocks can cool at least 4 orders of magnitude faster than they do according to easily obtained, observable, repeatable measurements. Uniformitarianism is where the evidence points. Catastrophism is the assumption that's based on a book of myths and legends that were borrowed and adapted from earlier cultures. Will she accurately describe anything about geology? Will she properly educate these college kids that she's talking to? To find out, tune in tomorrow, same Rhino time, same Rhino channel.